we're going to zoom out a little bit more because we talked a little bit of the neurospice and a little bit of like depression, anxiety, and a little bit of the LGBTQIA plus community. But now even zooming out, how do you feel about the label of being a cozy gamer?
Welcome. It's another episode of the Geeky Speechy podcast where you get to see the intersectionality of the geek fandom, therapy, mental health, education, just a lot of things that you might not necessarily think are related or have anything to do with each other or speak to each other, but we're here to have a lot of fun with that. I'm Mia, I'm a speech pathologist, and I work in a multidisciplinary team with psychologists and educators and occupational therapists and a lot of other different clinicians. And today we are going to be talking about labels. And this will only be a little bit of an introduction to the topic. Usually I would have a little bit of like a communication fact or something at the start of the episode and then sort of go into the more sort of nitty-gritty of the topic of the day and then have a bit of the gaming stuff at the end. I don't think we will actually have time for all of those aspects of the podcast today, but we are definitely going to introduce the topic and I want to hear from you, so please leave a comment if you're an audio only listener. If you're on a podcast app where you can leave a comment after you've reached your destination and you can safely type, then please leave a comment. Otherwise, even if you listen on that, jump over on YouTube and leave a comment. When I say labels, I mean that in the mental health space, we often do big diagnostic reports and help people on a journey, whether they have something under the neurodivergent umbrella, or maybe they present with something that, explains why they have a little bit of difficulty either with reading, writing, academic difficulty, social difficulty, and some of these can be really important. But for other people, it's really not. They just want to sort of treat either the symptoms or have a few more strategies to work with the way that their brain presents. Also, when I'm talking about labels, is labels that we give in life to different parts of the community, whether that's in the gaming space or sort of otaku culture, which in itself is an interesting label depending on which culture you are from or interact with or live in, and then also the LGBTQIA plus labels that have a lot of different vocabulary both inside the community and to present to allies and maybe just people that are seeking more education or not actually educated at all in that space. So we're going to talk about all of those little things, so let's jump into it.
All right, professional hat on. So when I started looking into this topic, because I just thought, this would be really interesting, because I've been talking to a lot of my friends about sort of different type of assessments leading to different diagnoses that we've been doing in clinic or sort of available, and also just sort of like the neurodivergent umbrella of yes, if you have dyslexia or specific learning disorder, which dyslexia is under that, that is still part of the neurodivergence umbrella. So going like, no, I just have dyslexia, I'm not neurodivergent. It's like, well, you don't have to use the label, but that is under that neurospicy or neurosparkly, if you want, umbrella. So we talked a little bit about that, but then also just looking at, okay, well, what does the research say about different labels? And well, turns out researching labels brings up a lot of stuff about food safety. And then I also found a really funny, it wasn't supposed to be funny, but I found a YouTube clip about labels are for food, not people. And it's interesting enough to watch. It's a few years old now. It sort of goes about, I guess it sort of plays into the concept of you don't want to sort of overclassify people because then there's the danger of them not being able to exist beyond that, which I feel like stereotyping in, especially in a lot of movies like 20, 30 years ago, like this is not a new problem. So although I appreciate what it was trying to say, just watching high school movies in the 2000s, I was very confused because at my school, doesn't matter whether you played sports or you were a music person, people just kind of got along. Like it wasn't like, no, we cannot sit with you. And but maybe I was just fortunate in South Africa, so baie dankie aan my maatjies in, jy weet, graad 4 tot graad 7, I guess. But yeah, I don't think that's the exception though. Like obviously some people do like to band together, but yeah, I don't think this is a new thing, the whole stereotyping, overclassifying people. So it's a bit of an odd one. Well, I looked at some different, resources, and a lot of medical descriptions, they also change over time. So a lot of times you'll see things like this is from the DSM-5, and we don't use the descriptors in DSM-4. And the biggest example of this is when people talk about Aspies, like Asperger's. And that term, although it was very valuable for people at the time, isn't used as a diagnostic medical term anymore. But for a lot of people, that is true to their identity, and they still really like using that label. And they're allowed to. I don't think it's fair to say, like, well, you don't have that, you just have autism. It's like, well, yes, they are still on the autism spectrum, but they can call it whatever makes them feel comfortable or have a sense of community. And similar to that, there's a lot of, even because the DSM-5 has been revised, which a lot of resources don't mention that, which is also a bit of a shame. But there's still a lot of changes that are occurring in the language, and this also goes to like gender dysphoria and transgender and non-binary people sort of finding solace that, okay, well, a lot of the language has changed, which helps them with, achieving that sort of nomenclature where they can talk to health professionals and have the terminology, or at least just helping medically. But that's not always the case, and that definitely isn't the case in all countries and cultures. So getting to sort of like the labeling of autism, there's a lot of advocacy for that. The labeling that's been given to a lot of ways that we describe autism isn't very neuroaffirming, and so there's been a lot of work in that area, which I think is really good, because that's how we get to more of a common understanding. The contrast issue of that is if a lot of terms are almost too neuroaffirming, what gets lost is that person's substantial need for support, or maybe low levels of support, which is why the functioning levels come in. And I mean, at least in Australia, we don't really use, I still hear it from time to time, but like low functioning, high functioning that feels like a really harmful way to describe it. The levels, like level 1, 2, 3, isn't like, oh, level 3 of the worst autism. That is not what that means. It just means the level of support. And we've certainly seen clients that have accessed services for years, and when they've been diagnosed, they might have presented as a person with level 2 ASD, but that's come down to a level 1 over time because they have better coping strategies. And it doesn't mean that they don't need support at all anymore, or that their autism is not the cause of difficulty in their life, or life because of environment causes difficulty to them. It just means that it gives us a way to describe where people are at, and also funding. Like it shows where to give different funding to different people and what funding models would be the most appropriate. And then with Swinburne University, which is an Australian university, there was a really cool, I just read a bit of the paper, but there's actually a video as well, which I'll link in the show notes, which is about stigma, labeling and enabling autism. And it does touch a little bit on having the correct language, but then also it's not an excuse, it's just part of the picture. And I know that some people are a bit worried that if they get labeled a certain way, or even like, sometimes things are just hard sometimes, no matter who you are. And I guess not using that excuse for not being able to do something or not wanting to do something. Which brings me to the next article, which was a psychology one. It was in Science Direct, which was research on mental illness labeling has demonstrated that self-labeling, which is identifying with a mental illness label like I have depression, is associated with internalized stigma, maladaptive responsive to that stigma, and a lower quality of life. So this actually looked at some people that said, I have anxiety. They tend to have it reframe in their mind so that it is harmful. I don't think this would be the case for everyone. I think a lot of people that are in denial that they have clinical depression, that label can be very meaningful to them. But I think it is more just not to sort of dampen your potential because of that. There's also then an article the depression schema, how labels, features, and causal explanations affect lay conceptions of depression. And so it talks a bit about how we label something as stress or being sad. I saw a great Instagram reel, I think, and it was this comedian that said, when I was young, I didn't have depression. Oh, no. It was like, when I was young, I didn't call it depression. Or I didn't call it anxiety. I was just a bit stressed. And if you said to someone, oh, I'm feeling a bit stressed, then they would ask you more about it. But these days, if you say, oh, I'm anxious, then people are just like, same. And they don't really ask anymore. And so, isn't that interesting? Like, comedy is such a great way to have a little bit of a moment in time insight into where we are as a society. And it also depends, again, what culture, what country, what areas you live in. Then there was an article I found from Germany, the Germans' population's attitude towards mental disorders. And I really wanted to use this as an example because I feel like a lot of people blanket the West, but the West has a lot of different cultures within itself. And internet culture does sort of make that global citizen feeling a bit more prominent, and it's not necessarily incorrect, but it does talk about well, this one I could only find the abstract, unfortunately, but it shows the dynamics that have changed over the last 30 years. And this one was to do with something like depression evoking a lot less negative emotions than schizophrenia. And that a lot of people are met more with understanding today in German society. So in addition to the increasing openness and I guess like normality and the concept of mental illnesses that have changed, that there's still that perception of, well, if it's a mood disorder or if there's something, I guess, that is a bit more different to what you see every day. It's like, well, psychotherapy, medication, all of that would be readily resources that are recommended. But then the spiritual side of things, so like going to a pastor or a spiritual support, that is sort of lessened over time. But it also depends on what you present with. So I found that one quite interesting for the depression side of things. Then there was an article, I can't remember where it was from. I'm trying to find it now again, but it talks a little bit about ADHD and actually talking a bit about the mood disorders. I was talking to my mom about this the other day. Some people that have a confirmed diagnosis of something like bipolar disorder, especially if they've gotten their symptoms really well managed or they're on lithium or like some other medication that works really well for them, to try and explain to people why they can't really do something on a certain day, they'll often use a more well-known or even just well-spoken about in the media. They'll use terminology like, oh, just my ADHD is acting up today. And I think it's because there is a lot less stigma associated with ADHD than having a mood disorder or like a personality disorder. And honestly, if that's what works and that makes you feel comfortable and safe, go for it. Obviously, if this is not supposed to minimize people with ADHD, because the contrast to people not having as much of a stigma associated with ADHD, if it becomes too overgeneralized, people don't recognize that this is still a really difficult thing to live with. And I see that a lot with family and friends. And it's great that people are talking more about it and they're really happy about that. But on that day when it's just a really disorganized day or the processing speed is just not processing, it's still a sucky day. And there's not quite maybe the empathy that there would have been when it was a bit more unknown. So it's interesting. It's like more knowledge is good, but it can also be harmful when it's too well known. I don't know. It's such an interesting field. I think also with a lot of YouTubers talking a lot about getting diagnosed, it's good to get adults, especially women that have elevated levels of anxiety and depression, which is directly associated or in the background of a diagnosis of autism, ADHD, or mental illness, because the opportunity wasn't given to them to be diagnosed. So a lot of them are getting assessed, and it's so expensive once you're an adult. I'm not saying it's not when you're a child, and it also depends on where you live. But yeah, it's a tough road, and it also, because you've been using a lot of strategies and you've already implemented a lot of things, it just feels like, oh well, it's not that bad. And it's like, well, you don't have to get diagnosed. It's just one of those things that if you want to know more about yourself and how you work, then it's good to either get assessed or even just have a look at some strategies. I know in speech pathology, we're not that attached to a label for diagnosis. We very much look on, oh, okay, you're substituting this sound for this sound. Let's treat that. And it is cool to know why. And sometimes, especially when it starts going into the more motoric movements rather than a phonological process, then it can be quite important. But for the most part, the reason why you're having issues with it is not that important as the what strategy works for you. Let's keep doing that, and let's give you the tools to go work on that independently and then come back. So then we also have just even Healthline, surprisingly, even though it's on a research journal, something I feel breaks down a lot of information quite well. So if you just want something that's like a bit of a easy read, not too verbose, then yeah, go to Healthline. Like it seems to be quite good. If someone has a contrasting opinion to that or has had a bad experience on Healthline, also put that in the comments. I'm not here to say that they're the best thing ever. I've just found information that has been in line with research that I've read on, well-established places. And there's also a few open articles, like open access articles in the Journal of Social and Political Psychology. I think the problem again with articles is it's sometimes really difficult to access because of the level of academic language. Like for me, I spoke Afrikaans all my life. I still speak Afrikaans. I went to school. Most of my schooling was in Afrikaans, but I really struggle reading research articles in Afrikaans because I went to university in English. So accessing academic language on that level in Afrikaans is quite difficult. However, now we're sort of going into a different aspect of labeling, which is about extending the social category label effect to stigmatized groups, lesbian and gay people reaction to homosexual as a label. And this was done by it was a few universities that were involved, but the Pennsylvania State University, they were sort of talking about the medicalized and using the label of homosexual for a long time was sort of seen so much as like other, which in a way, I guess that's sort of what queer and what weird and different is. But it just talks about like the different demographics and what they prefer. So they might feel better with using something like lesbian or gay to explain, well, what is their experience, and then other people still refers to homosexuality. So that is interesting. It didn't really talk a lot about like romantic labels, so like whether you're like biromantic or homoromantic or heteroromantic, but I think it was more about the history of a lot of labels, just like how queer was used as an insult at some point, but it was very much taken back by the community as an overarching term for LGBTQIA+. I know every Pride Month there's a new person saying like all of these labels are just getting too ridiculous, and a lot of those people are just talking about like, why do we need the label pansexual? And it's like, oh wow, that's not even going very deep in the labeling system of queer identities. If they just look at all the micro labels under asexuality, that is wild. So I think that the labels are really useful to actually learn about the community and different people's experiences. I found that with myself and also with a lot of other people that sometimes they'll sort of deep dive into all the different labels and micro labels, and then they kind of go out, like they zoom out a bit further and they go, yeah, it's probably this very specific thing with a little bit of a specific thing of that, or in this situation it's a bit more this, but I'm just going to use queer. Or some people just like, oh, I'll just use bisexual. Or even there's some people in the asexual community that are like, well, the only platonic companionship or the only romantic companionship I seek is with women, but I'm not physically attracted to women, so I am either, they would say homoromantic, or they would just say that they're lesbian, because it's not the person that they're describing that to's business what that entails. Only if they are with a partner, then they can talk a bit more about, what does asexuality mean to them, and how do they respond to a partner, or what kind of relationships do they seek? And that extends to a lot of different aspects of the community, not just the asexual community. So yeah, it is interesting how we've kind of gotten to the point where we've sort of hyper micro labeled everything and try to classify everything, and that's also not needed. Sometimes it can just be simple. But if that's the way that your journey goes, and that's the way that you find comfort and community, then use all the labels you need to. And that's completely fine. And sometimes there is also a difference between labels that you use online and in person. Because when you're part of a specific online conversation, some people can be quite defensive or even combative with, you can't speak to this because you're not part of this specific community. And maybe you are. It's just not the way you've identified yourself in that very conversation. So a lot of people just kind of list what they are. So sort of going, okay, well, I am, what's like a good example? Aromantic, pansexual, polyamorous. And a lot of people say like, well, you don't need to overclassify it like that. But maybe for that person in that conversation, it was important. And all of these are just different tools to get to an answer, knowing more about yourself. And also sometimes you don't need all the things, or sometimes that's just a part of the journey, and that's okay too. And if someone says to you, well, this is what I identified with, but now it's changed, well, just take it on face value. Some people are very fluid in their sexuality, and some people just sort of change once or twice, and that's okay too. Like, it's not your place to police them within the queer community, and definitely not outside of the queer community. And unfortunately, there is a lot of that even within those circles. So I think with labels, it is interesting. And we're going to zoom out a little bit more, because we talked a little bit about the neurospice and a little bit of like depression, anxiety, and a little bit of the LGBTQIA plus community. But now even zooming out, how do you feel about the label of being a cozy gamer? Maybe that's something that really matters a lot to you because you found community in that space. Or maybe you play a lot of other different games, but you play this one game. Like maybe you play Stardew Valley with a particular friend, and then someone labels you as that, and it means something to you, and you don't want to be part of that, and that's okay as well. So even in the gaming space, it's wild how people will just put someone in a box that they don't want to be in, or even like people put themselves in a box sometimes, and it's also okay to be in a box. It's your box. I just think it's interesting how language also changes over time, and this brings us to how excited I am about these things, because it's speech pathology and linguistics are part of this idea of language changes. And you'll see all over the internet things like, I don't understand what Gen Alpha are talking about, or I don't even understand why Gen X refers to it as that, and it's like, it's okay. It's okay, because language changes to suit that particular society. And I remember even moving to Australia, and like we still very much use dude, and not because it's the early 2000s, that's just this terminology that we still use. But I do not feel confident in saying, like, using the word mate in Australia, because yes, I have been here for 12 years, but it's just not something that comes natural to me. I'm not going to say it in Australian like, oh, that's so 2000s. Why would you even use that? Because that's not appropriate. It's not their culture. So also, just because you've heard something in a culture like American college movies does not mean that for everyone that word only exists in that space. And also the concept of getting offended by certain terminology. If something genuinely is a trigger point for you, there is a nice way of bringing that up and a respectful way of bringing that up, because maybe to the person saying that, yeah, sometimes someone is just going to be mean or just going to be wanting to provoke an argument from you. But most of the time, well, maybe I shouldn't say most of the time, but a lot of the times, it's just because, one, that person might not know that is a harmful term, or two, maybe in the society that they grew up, that is a celebrated term. So I think just having a bit more, just a broad understanding. And this brings me to my last point, which is the algorithm. When you get further down into a community and that, unfortunately, what the internet does is it just throws you the same content from people with similar ideas, and it gets tagged onto different things that are still the same, and it feels like, oh, there's like so much information out there, but you're in a flask. You're just not in a flask. Is it a vase? What is the, like, you're in a self-contained space, and when you're outside of that space, it might be different and it might work different. So I do recommend occasionally just taking a bit of power back from the algorithm. Just watch some things, or you don't even have to watch it. Pick some things on YouTube, open all the files, go have dinner. Just so it sort of shakes up the algorithm a little bit, or search for things that are a bit outside of the things that you like. It doesn't have to be something you're opposed to, just other things. Just to get a little bit more feedback of what other people's opinions and ideas are, because that's important too. Because if you go in like too narrow, you lose that broad scope of opinions, and that's important too. And it's also important for self-growth and self-development. So yeah, that is currently all that I have on labels. It's such a deep topic, and I don't want this to be too long. It's just sort of a food for thought. And let's talk more about it, but let's talk about it in a respectful way. And I don't want to see people having massive arguments with each other. Again, you can approach your conversation with respect. All right, well, let's go to the next part. All right. So, now for the gaming segment. Well, just generally what have I been watching, playing, all of those things. Humble Bundle this month had brought out a kind of a Pride collection of games that were either made by queer creators or had some LGBTQI plus themes. And since it was Pride Month, I downloaded that bundle and then also tried some of the indie games from the Indie Live Game Showcase from Tokyo, which I was so grateful to be involved in. And you should totally go check out the stream and see me get very excited about new and creative projects. And it was so good. I also went to the Games Development Festival in Brisbane, which showcased a lot of Australian developers and artists and just really creative people working on gaming, and not just video games, board games as well. So all of that, like some of it I do have here on YouTube, but a lot of that I do tend to just make little reels or put like a reel of photos just on Instagram. So yeah, I would definitely say follow me on Instagram. It does cross-post to Facebook, and it started cross-posting to Threads, which confused me a little bit, but ek dink dit werk? I'm not too sure. So some of the games that I played, I would like to talk about more in depth about, but I don't think we'll have so much time in this particular episode. So the stream that I have planned soon will be just playing some of the games. So like Stray Gods, Arcadia Fallen, The Second Coffee Talk. Oh, I had something else. I bought another game. Oh, it's like Rakuen or something. And then also on Switch, I played the Cat Quest 3 demo, which is kind of unrelated. I've also been playing a lot of Shantae, Half Genie Hero, which I bought in like 2016. And I just thought, yeah, I really want to revisit that game because this year on the Game Boy. And I don't mean just like, oh, it was a missing Game Boy game or like a Game Boy game that they never developed, because it was. But this is a game that is going to release hard copy on a cartridge. So, yeah, quite excited offer. Unfortunately, the pre-orders for that has closed, and I really hope that they get a lot of support and then open up the ability to buy that again, because I don't want to miss out on buying a Game Boy game. Such a good console. And that's not even a nostalgia thing, because I very much spent a lot of time on the DS as well. I just really, really like the Game Boy. It's a lot more compact. It's easy to carry around, and I can't wait to get a flip phone at some point this year, which again, I didn't have a flip phone growing up, but just because the way that they look, there's so many cool wallpapers that are like Game Boy aesthetic. It's very exciting. Anime wise, what have I been watching? I have been watching anime. I started the Black Butler public school arc, and I was a bit hesitant going into it. Like, I didn't watch it when it first came out because The animation looked a little bit odd, but that's such a bad trailer for the actual anime. And I know one of my friends, she loved this particular arc in the manga. So yeah, I would recommend it. I didn't grow up with Black Butler or was in that sort of Black Butler girly fandom phase thing. But I really, really enjoyed it when I did end up watching it. So, and my mom also enjoyed it. So it was something fun that we watched together. So yes, enjoying Black Butler. And then I also started watching another one of I think it's like, not My Next Life as the Villainess. That is very good. Nia, wat was dit? Oh, I think I'm in love with the villainess. Yeah, so that one is just a little bit of fun. And then One Piece, I've taken a little bit of a break from because I finished a really big arc. So I thought, okay, well, I've watched a little bit of Skype in terms of the movie OVA and started reading a little bit of it, but I'm going to take a break to sort of focus on playing a lot of these different indie games. So yeah, so streams coming up will be a gameplay kind of stream, and then the just talking one will be sort of wrapping up a lot of those different thoughts. And I am going to do an art stream, and no, this is not me drawing. That would be an awful time. Ask any one of my clients. It would be me looking at different art. I've been thinking of doing this for a very long time. I would really love this to be a charity stream, but there's just a lot of contention at the moment between like artists and credit and things, and I just want to look at pretty art and obviously like give the credit where it's due. A lot of this will be older art pieces, so not really from this year or last year, so hopefully avoiding a lot of the AI art things. And then recently I decided to revisit a lot of the Scooby-Doo movies. And I realized that a lot of the Scooby-Doo movies I watched was actually the ones from the 80s, not the 90s. So it's been a bit unusual going back. I've definitely seen parts of it because it used to just air on Boomerang at like the kindy that I was at before I went to school, or like not after school care, like before school care. I don't know. I definitely saw snippets of some of these movies. And so I don't know, they have a bit of a different feel to the 80s one, so it's been interesting going back. I don't really have a particular reason for it. I was just in the mood for Scooby-Doo things, the greatest polycule, and yeah, it's been a good time. And for music-wise, I've just been enjoying my normal video game music trend, but also I've been going back to some very early 2000s, like that sort of like anime pop, not quite nightcore, like just before Nightcore, which has been a bit unusual. And so I've been listening to a bit of that, and then just my normal like 80s rock stuff. So it's been good. So have you had any new interest or old interest that have popped up in this last month? Let me know in the comments. And that is basically it for the pop culture stuff. So let's wrap it up. Thank you so much for watching. I really had a great time talking about this topic and finding different articles, but I still want to find more. So please link me in. If you find any cool resources or articles or even just a personal account, leave them in the comments or message me on Instagram.
The outro after the outro. Shout out to those from Duitsland. It was really interesting to go onto YouTube, and usually I've got a couple of countries, like expected countries, and then some other ones, and yeah, I got some people from both Sweden and Germany, so hello! Ja, dit is definitely lekker om van mensen van andere landen te horen. So yeah, make sure to subscribe, and also please explore different audio platforms that you can listen to the Geeky Speechy on, just so that we can get the podcast out there. More people, more resources. It's good stuff. Have a good day.